Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's All Atlantic Connect webinar. We are going to wait a couple more minutes to let people in, and then we will start this session. In the meantime, please feel free to, I would like to invite you to um, introduce yourself in the chat. Please share your name and the place you are connecting from. It's always nice to see our community to see where people are coming from. Okay. Welcome to those that are connecting. Just to let you know that we are waiting another minute to let more attendees connect. Okay, so I think we can start now. So again, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's All Atlantic Connect webinar, organized under the Oceano project. I'm going to share my presentation. Mhm. Okay. I think it's good now. So these Atlantic Connect webinar are organized under the Oceano project, which supports the All Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance, or ORIA. My name is Tanya Lishan, and it's a great pleasure to have you all with us today. Before we begin, I would like to invite everyone joining us to introduce yourself in the chat. Please share your name and the place you are connecting from. You are also very welcome to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A panel, and then we will address them during the panel discussion. Also, a quick note before we proceed: this session is being recorded and will be made available online after the webinar. So throughout these All Atlantic Connect webinars, we aim to strengthen connections across the Atlantic Ocean, bringing together scientists, decision makers, youth, and communities to share experiences and ideas. In AWARIA, the All Atlantic Ocean Research Innovation Alliance, it's much more than a framework for scientific collaboration. It builds on more than a decade of science diplomacy. It all began in 2011 when the EU adopted the Atlantic Strategy. Then in 2013, the Galway Statement established the first collaboration across the North Atlantic between EU, Canada, and the US. And here I show you a timeline of key milestones on building the All-Atlantic community coast to coast and pole to pole. Today, the Alliance brings together 13 member countries and growing community dedicated to advancing a shared vision for a sustainable Atlantic Ocean. You'll see that we have several countries within the Atlantic region on the east and west coast, and also north and south. So during one of the All Atlantic Forum, it is in Cape Town in 2023, two priority action areas were identified based on the All Atlantic Declaration, which was signed in 2022. These action areas are guiding our work in Oceano projects. At Oceano, we are very proud to lead the action area number 1 on coastal resilience, which is focused on understanding the relationship between ocean and climate and how this knowledge can help strengthen the resilience of coastal communities. And very briefly, the action area number 2 on ocean observation and modeling is led by NOAA in US. And it's coordinating the Atlantic Ocean observing and modeling capacities. And here I'm showing you a very nice visual created during the All Atlantic Forum held this past September in Brussels, which nicely illustrates what was discussed in the session on results and future actions. Working towards the 2 action areas, it also highlights how Oceano is supporting AORIA through support and governance, giving support to the organization of All Atlantic Forum, engagement community, and much more. We are now looking ahead to our next All Atlantic Forum, which will be held in Brazil, in Salvador, Bahia, taking place in April 2026. Until then, we will have several events and initiatives to help us build momentum, including this All Atlantic Connect webinars series. And this first series is organized in collaboration with Oceans20 Brazil and Ocean20 South Africa. I'm going now to stop sharing my presentation, and I would like to play a video. Welcome video from our partner Alexander Tucha, which led the Oceans20 Brazil activities. Here.
Africa's current leadership.
Oh, sorry.
Friends of the Ocean. Welcome to our webinar promoted by the Oceano Coordination Support Action in partnership with Oceans20, with reflections from Brazil's past presidency and South Africa's current leadership of G20. We are delighted to have you with us today to discuss vital issues impacting our oceans and, by extension, the future of the planet. The O20, which emerged during the last G20 cycles in Indonesia and India, plays a key role in giving civil society a voice in ocean discussions. By bringing together non-governmental organizations, private initiatives, indigenous peoples, traditional communities, and scientists, O20 strengthens the presence of the ocean on global agendas. The formal creation of Oceans20, the civil society engagement group on oceans, by the Brazilian presidency at the G20, represents a historic milestone, recognizing the central role of the oceans in the global climate, energy, and environment agendas. The oceans are interconnected, but they are also diverse in their characteristics, and this plurality needs to be considered in our discussions and recommendations for action. In Brazil, the ocean agenda was one of the 4 pillars of the Working Group on Climate and Environmental Sustainability, coordinated by the Brazilian Ministry of the Environment, and was intertwined with other working groups reflecting the transversal nature of this topic. O20 was coordinated by the UNESCO Chair for Ocean Sustainability at the University of São Paulo, in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, the UN Global Compact, the Brazilian Biodiversity Fund, FUNBIO, and the National Institute for Ocean Research, INPO. In 2025, South Africa is leading O20, and the United States of America will come next in sustaining and strengthening this process. Oceano supports the All-Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance, AORIA, which connects researchers and institutions across the Atlantic Ocean, fostering the creation of an all-Atlantic community, promoting the exchange of knowledge and experiences, essential for the conservation and sustainable management of the Atlantic Ocean. In this All Atlantic Connect webinar series, we bring together experts from different areas of knowledge to share insights and foster a deep dialogue on the importance of the ocean in our lives, emphasizing the urgent need for collective action to elaborate the Oceans 20 recommendations through global cooperation under the leadership of South Africa. Get ready, get ready for a session rich in learning and exchanging ideas. Feel free to participate with questions and comments throughout the event.
Thank you, Alexandre Tucha, for the very nice message. So these webinar series started on October 21st, which and all the sessions can be viewed at the All Atlantic YouTube channel. So please visit to see to watch the recordings. Today we will focus on climate, energy, and social inclusion from our South Africa perspective. We will explore how advancing an ambitious and inclusive climate agenda, together with a just energy transition, can drive sustainable development and resilience across the Atlantic Basin, aligned with priorities of AWARIA and Oceans 20. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Yanga Malotona. Yanga is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria and project manager and communication lead for Emerging Scholar Initiative. She's a versatile energy policy and climate change analyst with a passion for addressing global challenges through innovation, collaboration, and strategic problem solving. So thank you, Yanga, for joining us, and the screen is yours.
Thanks, Tanya. Everyone, I feel a bit put on the spot here because Tanya had said I was going to go last, but it's okay. I'm ready. I'm excited. Tanya, I did just want to bring to your attention that the participants said that the chat has been disabled, so they're not able to post any questions in the chat other than in the Q&A section. I just wanted to make you aware of that, as I am now sharing my screen quickly. Okay. All right. There we go. Good afternoon. It's afternoon from my side. Good morning if you're joining us in the morning, and good evening if you're joining us in the evening. My name is Yanga Malotana, and I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm very honored to be here to come and do this presentation. From my side, if you will, I'm going to start it off looking at it a little bit more in a broader context in terms of energy policy and some of the challenges that our continent faces, and bring it a little bit closer to South Africa, which is where I kind of have my specialty in. But I'm open to any questions as we kind of go through our session, and very keen to also engage with everybody. And just before I do, I wanted to give context that I don't necessarily specialize in oceans in and of themselves, but I am in the energy space, and in the energy space, it's becoming more and more clear, and of course in engaging with the ocean space as well, that the oceans are very important in terms of how we deal with the green transitions or anything to do with the energy transitions that we're trying to work towards through. So even though my presentation might not necessarily be deeply oceans based, just keep it in the back of your mind that it is still within context, and I will also speak about it within the context of the O20 Communiqué as well. With that being said, I'd like to get into it. When it comes to energy policy on the continent itself and global south phenomenon, it's something that we kind of label as a wicked problem, if you will. And how we understand it to be somewhat of a wicked problem is us seeing it almost as a problem that is so intricate and is so complex that it feels almost impossible to solve, but actually it requires its own complex solutions to it. And the oceans play a big role in terms of how we see the complexities and some of those complex solutions being part of the system too. What I always like asking people whenever I do this is just out of curiosity, and I can't see the chat right now in this moment as I'm presenting. I always like to know whether or not you think the wheel is the most important human invention, or if you think the fire is the most important human invention. And if so, why or why not? And I always present this picture together because we are at a point now where the two kind of coexist together. Something that was considered to be one of the most innovative things that human beings ever came with, the wheel, and something that's essential and crucial to essentially human survival, have kind of coincided together to be kind of where we are today in terms of how we understand energy and our engagement with it, right? And how this has kind of happened kind of in the little pictures that you see there. It's this fire had started and we moved into the industrial, evolution, to the light bulbs that we have at home and how we understand modernity, and potentially a very dark, grim future if we don't take care of our planet, because of the fossil fuels that we have become reliant on in terms of trying to sustain ourselves with energy. But I think it's very important for us to look at the evolution of energy in order for us to understand how we are evolving in terms of solutions that were created by the evolution of energy in the first place, right? So energy has been civilization's kind of fundamental driver throughout history. We've gone from wood, still there in some places, to animal power, to fossil fuels, and now we're kind of like in this era of renewables. But most importantly, it was essentially the backbone of industrialization and modern development between the 18th to the 19th century, where coal had powered the Industrial Revolution. And in the 20th century, oil and electricity transformed how we came to understand economies and birthed essentially global economies to the way that we see them today. And it's created somewhat of an unprecedented dependency in modern life today, because never before in human history have we needed to depend on electricity to be able to have basic needs. So, for example, the digital economy that we live in, I couldn't be here speaking to you today and us being connected globally without a constant, reliable source of electricity. Basic services now have become electricity dependent. Water pumping is reliant on electricity. Healthcare is reliant on electricity. Communications is reliant on electricity. And for the first time in human history, kind of where we are now, electricity is required for accessing water in many, many, many regions, right? Simple, drinkable water. So it's very, very important. How we engage with it. Then when you kind of come to our beautiful continent here in Africa, we kind of exist within somewhat of an energy paradox, right? The classic, we are a resource-rich continent, but we have significant energy poverty of close to 600 million Africans living in energy poverty, right? People without electricity access is close to 900 million, and they rely on traditional biomass for cooking. And I don't have time to get into the implications of that, but what's very important to note is that relying on traditional biomass means that a lot of people still on our continent have got cooking methods that are very harmful for their health, because they end up cooking inside the house with fumes that they inhale and therefore are more prone to respiratory issues, heart problems. And it's just unhealthy existences of energy systems that exist, but they still use them in order to survive, right? But then there's this contrast that exists where there's these vast energy sources that are so future-based, and also the energy sources that we're trying to transition into, where we know our continent is fantastic for solar. We know our continent is fantastic for wind, for green hydrogen. And our continent itself is kind of surrounded by two massive oceans. And so you would think offshore wind projects should also be kind of picking up. But then at the same time, there's the low access rate that exists too. And part of why this exists is that there's a double challenge that exists. And that's kind of the heart of the wicked problem is there's work in trying to provide basic access while at the same time trying to support modernization. And this is where we then have the challenge of balancing the four tenets of energy security. And the four tenets of energy security is electricity that is available, electricity that is affordable, electricity that is uninterrupted, and more recently integrated into that definition is electricity that is environmentally friendly. Now, within our own continent itself, considering the fact that for the longest time, the three tenets of energy security had to do with availability, affordability, and it being uninterrupted. Those three tenets were barely ever even dealt with in the first place. And then you bring in the environmental factor too. You make it completely difficult, thus then creating that basic challenge of trying to provide access while at the same time supporting modernization and trying to protect our planet simultaneously, right? And so then that's where the wicked problem kind of comes in. And essentially, it's just the fact that there's multiple stakeholders with competing interests, complex interdependencies exist. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution for Africa's rapidly changing technological and economic landscape that's changing forward, but also at the same time is kind of stuck. But then also the intergenerational impacts and considerations are also completely complex when it comes to the energy conversation. In the wicked dimension in and of itself, we have the political one, and just very briefly, there's a balancing of trying to balance governance, trying to balance national interests with regional cooperation, trying to balance political stability and energy security, and more importantly, the idea of energy democratization and access to equity. And that's where we have then the birth of the idea of having a just transition, where the transition to the renewables has to be one that takes care of everyone. But in order to be able to take care of everyone, all the other parts of the political dimension have to be dealt with, and that's just one thing. And then there's still the economic considerations that we have to worry about. There's not enough capital to help with these transitions. There's not enough capital to invest fully in green, while at the same time, you have African countries that are more worried about economic development in its immediate term and creating industrialization in its immediate term, kind of like catching up, than worrying about the future long-term consequences of how it may be. And it's a little bit of an unfair situation because you have a continent that contributes the least amount of CO2 emissions and yet feels the biggest environmental impact, but also the continent that's the most behind when it comes to its energy access and its transitions, that essentially is saying we kind of do need to rely on the fossil fuels that are making the environment a little bit difficult in order for us to achieve the three. But they can't do that because then the environmental factors mean that there's worsening of climate change effects. There's the fact that traditional sources still need to compete with environmental impacts. Can't just get rid of biomass because people depend on that to be able to eat. But at the same time, there's international climate commitments that we're doing. I mean, COP30 is going on right now. And I was having a conversation with a friend the other day that the Paris Climate Agreement was signed almost 10 years ago to the day, and COP has been going on now for 30 years, and we're still stuck in this weird dimension of trying to balance politics, trying to balance economics, but at the center of it, trying to make sure that the environmental factors are taken care of, right? And at the core of that has to do with finances and how we move with it. So just very briefly across the continent, key countries when it comes to this energy situation I've just highlighted. Nigeria, just as examples of how the balancing is difficult. It's a country that which high oil wealth, but then at the same time has its developmental challenges, but is still working to try towards moving towards energy transitions and having to make decisions on whether or not it's better to make those oil investments or to make investments in green energy because we want to protect the planet. In Kenya, a country that's leading in geothermal leadership on the continent, working very hard for renewable energy integration, but at the same time facing the challenges of high traditional biomass dependence that's going on in the country. Morocco, similar to the South Africa situation, very high coal dependency, and therefore has got very ambitious renewable targets and implementation plans, but a country that still requires coal to be able to function and to be. And essentially, that's South Africa as well, high coal dependency. But in its case of the just transition, it's the fact that should we separate from the coal itself, millions of jobs are compromised, an economy is compromised because of how we rely on the mineral complex systems that we kind of have. And just very briefly to understand South Africa's energy system, to bring it a little bit more to home, essentially there's just like two factors and components that work somewhat at play that people tend to focus on. The one is load shedding, right? This is the most obvious one. Load shedding was when we were having periodic cutoffs of electricity scheduled by the government due to the fact that there was a high demand on the grid, but then there was a low supply of coal, for example. And because of that, we essentially had a load shedding period that lasted between 2008 and 2024, and it had dire economic repercussions for the economy in and of itself. Back again to the point where I was making, that energy has become so important just for the livable situations, right? But if you break it down from a systemic perspective, right, where you don't just understand it as immediate matters of how this complex situation is happening and you look at it from a bigger landscape, load shedding was just one very, very small component. And you can see over here, at least what I like to explain is the fact that there's multiple intricate systems that are interacting with one another in South Africa's energy system that are working to reveal why there are specific problems, but at the same time are also working to reveal areas in which we are trying to solve the issues, right? So in that first system that you're seeing over there on your left, it's the system that was showing why conditions of energy security in this country have not been met. We've not had electricity that's available, affordable, uninterrupted, and it sure as hell has been electricity that has been environmentally hazardous. And people tend to think that it's just because of load shedding, but there's a legacy that apartheid and segregation brought in that makes that kind of thing exist. Then at the same time, we look at specific actors, one particular person of, oh, well, it doesn't exist because there's this one power plant that supplies this power in South Africa. And the most obvious answers there would be the fact that they just had old equipment and low investment, not taking into consideration human feelings, essentially, where greed and fear played a role, and where there's fear and greed brewed a mafia, essentially, and a coal mafia that captured and brewed indications of corruption, and there was sabotage and state capture, all of these things that still led to what was happening in system one as well. Then if you look into the next systems, it's stakeholder systems and how they interact with each other, right? That you can see kind of identified over there. But then at the same time, this is existing within a system where there's still these policies that are trying to be implemented to respond to this energy crisis that the country has. And part of that is the Just Energy Transition Plan, which promotes retributive justice and promotes distributive justice and is aiming to have a green industry, good governance, social support, and active labor market. And that's where the oceans are supposed to be playing a role, right? Particularly in terms of its investments in offshore wind systems, right? But unfortunately, when it comes to offshore in South Africa, there hasn't been that much investment that has occurred, but there's been a plethora of challenges that have made it so that our government doesn't necessarily interact or see the value of the ocean in terms of trying to solve the energy crisis that we're kind of facing in the country. So it's kind of like this paradoxical system that we are living in, and just this constant system of crisis, right? I'm seeing I'm going a little bit over time, but just to like really get into it, the only way forward when you have something that complex then is to have an integrated approach, an approach that takes into consideration that systems can be complex like this. And in them being complex, you therefore need to have complex solutions to them. And I think that was what was so important about the O20 Communiqué that was released in Brazil last year, is that the idea of an integrated approach was deeply, deeply important and highly emphasized, right? The idea of having multi-stakeholder engagement, contextual solutions, balancing immediate needs, and knowledge sharing and capacity building, but also importantly, phased implementation stages. And I think this year's O20 Communiqué that South Africa released just last week at its Oceans20 summit tries to recognize this integrated approach as being a very important step in how we move forward with the 7 key recommendations that you see over there, right? In terms of perhaps how the ocean and energy security can be met together at the same time. And of course, it's not to ignore the fact that there aren't any innovative solutions emerging in order for this to occur, right? There's a greater advocacy for decentralized energy systems and microgrids, advocacy for leapfrogging technologies, having policy innovations and adaptive governance, making sure that there's public-private partnerships and new financing models, which I think is a very important theme that theme 1 highlights from the O20 Communiqué, where it's talking about the idea of a sustainable blue economy. And part of that sustainable blue economy is also us figuring out this complex energy system that we have. And of course, digital solutions for energy management, which I don't have time to go into now. But with that being said, my point in this, if there's anything you want to take away from me here, right, is in order for us to solve it, whether it is through solving it with solutions with our friends in the ocean, whether it was us solving it with solutions in inland, essentially what we're all aiming for is to have some sort of sustainability, right? And that sustainability requires on all of these 3 tenets to be met. It requires for the economical, the ecological, and the social to speak to each other. But the only way that they speak to each other is to make sure there's viability, there's equitability, there's bearability, in order to have a full balance of everything on the outside. And essentially, that's what the just transition is aiming to do. However, the risk of not having the pursuit of sustainability at the center, and my fear and the trends that we're kind of seeing at the moment is moving towards a green economy, but a green economy that remains an extractive economy that is neither equitable, neither bearable, but is still viable. So an economy that only speaks ecologically, right? And what I mean by this is you just look at simple statistics that have just come out recently, the fact that there's an issue currently happening right now in the DRC where there's been drilling so deep for copper that water tables have been hit in the pursuit of us trying to have green futures, right? There's the fact that there's still child labor happening in these mines in the name of extracting resources that are going to help with the EV cars that are going to help us meet our green targets. We need to make sure that the full balancing of the economic, environmental, and social is taken into consideration. Otherwise, we will trap ourselves in a continuous cycle of an extractive green market. And in that case, we would have ticked the box of economic sustainability, but not necessarily full social sustainability. And the very glad that the O20 Communiqué, and I know it's in a different section in the book in and of itself, has highlighted the fact that there's a call for a pause in deep sea mining, because we know that part of why the deep sea mining in the oceans is occurring is in pursuit of some critical minerals that are really necessary in the green transition process, because the inland ones are becoming higher and higher in demand, and we need to start searching somewhere else. And so how we see innovative technologies and how we see solutions should not be extractive in nature. Ideally, we don't want to continue to have what we have there on the left, an extractive economy. We want to move into a living economy, right? An economy where there is a change of rules from international, national, local, a change of values in and of itself, and more importantly, something that's new that's built, where there's regeneration, where there's a caring and sacredness, where there's deep democracy when it comes to governance, cooperation, ecological and social well-being. That's what we want to push towards so that we don't stay in an extractive economy, what's the word, pattern. And with that being said, I'm going to stop there. But before I do, I just do want to say that you know, it's a complex situation and it's a complex context that we have, but it is not impossible. Energy policy in Africa requires balancing multiple competing priorities. And most importantly, the solutions must be contextual adaptive, and inclusive. Opportunities for leapfrogging must be conventional development pathways, need both immediate action and long-term vision. And the idea of African-led solutions should not just be put to the side. And international cooperation is very important. And having platforms like this is incredible to be able to see how that is happening. And thank you so much. Happy to connect. Those are my details over there. And I'm keen to hear any questions you guys might have. I'm going to leave that up for an extra 5 seconds before I stop sharing. But thank you so much, guys. I'll be here for any question and answers. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yanga. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving us a very insightful overview of the wicked problem, the just transition, but also bringing so many disciplines into your talk. And really nice for your message of hope at the end. That is really, really problematic. It's very challenging, but it's doable. Also, apologies for putting you on the spot, but then I realized that you were first in the agenda. Sorry. So now let's move on to our next presentation by Dr. Vishal Surban, a senior lecturer in the School of Law and Unit for Maritime Law and Maritime Studies at the University of, I might mispronounce, Kuala Natal. His research interest lies on the field of law of the sea, particularly maritime jurisdiction, maritime security, and African regional maritime policy. So thank you, Vishal, for joining us. The screen is yours.
So thank you very much, Tanya, and I send my warm greetings to all of you from the very warm coastal city of Durban on the east coast of South Africa. So we had a wonderful presentation by Younger that sets a very interesting stage. And what I'd like to do in this presentation is to bring that discussion in a little bit more of a domestic context. So my presentation today is almost like a story, and I'm going to talk to you about social inclusion and how that manifests on a domestic realm and how the lessons that can be learned from how South Africa dealt with these issues of social inclusion and public participation and how they can be applied on a more broader international, regional, and foreign scale. So the first thing that I'd like to speak about is what really is South Africa's policy orientation towards social inclusion. Now, South Africa made a very short 5-minute statement at the recent UN Oceans conference in Nice. One of the first points is that it was stated that South Africa values integration of robust scientific research, but they also referred to traditional knowledge systems in ocean governance. Also, they spoke about, on the climate change front, about their plans and strategies to strengthen the resilience of vulnerable coastal communities. And thirdly, in terms of South Africa's own ocean strategy known as Operation Perkisa, the Oceans Economy Program, they spoke specifically on inclusive and sustainable growth. And my emphasis there is on inclusive. So from these three statements, we are seeing references to coastal communities, indigenous communities, and that's where the focus of this presentation lies. Now, an interesting fact is that close to 50% of Africa's population live within 100 kilometers of the coast. So inevitably, you will see from this diagram, countries like South Africa have roughly 30% of its national population residing within that particular distance of the coast. And so you would find that coastal communities have long-standing heritages, long-standing interactions that span many generations, and their relationship with the ocean spans that time. Now, immediately, one of the key takeaways from this presentation is that I'm going to talk to you about a particular matter that went to a South African court. Now, I'm referring to one particular case, but there have been a number of cases with similar issues in South African courts. This particular case took place on South Africa's east coast. The region is known as the Wild Coast, and the other cases as well with similar issues took place on the west coast. Now, this litigation shows how ocean governance interacts with aspects like constitutional rights, with social inclusion, and this concept of environmental justice. How local courts deal with these issues is an important template. It is an important exemplar for how the Oceans20 framework calls for very similar kinds of inclusive participation in shaping the blue economy. So let me then delve into the details of this case. Now, this little image is, if you can keep this in your mind, this is the region in which all the issues arose in this case along the wild coast of South Africa. And this is an area that is in some aspects a marine protected area, and in other aspects you have coastal communities resided. So in this particular region, you had large conglomerate companies, and for the convenience here, we're going to refer to the prominent one, which is Shell, and they applied to the South African government for an exploration right to prospect along the coastline under a statute called the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act. Now, as part of that application to explore for subsea oil and gas reserves, they needed to submit what is termed an environmental management program, the EMPR. In that EMPR, they have to show that they consulted with communities, they consulted with the public, and they provided all the necessary documents and paperwork in order to go ahead with this application. This application was sent to the Petroleum Agency of South Africa, and having reviewed this environmental management program, that agency granted an exploration right to Shell and its associated entities. So what Shell intended then to do was to conduct a seismic survey along the coastline. They would bring in specialized vessels that have seismic survey equipment that essentially use acoustic guns that create a vibration along the seabed, and then that vibration returns back. It's picked up by sensors, and that can determine subsea geological formations where there would be oil and gas reserves. Now, whilst all of this was happening, this happened over a long period of time. This application started around about 2013. As soon as Shell determined its intention to now conduct these seismic surveys, the coastal indigenous communities were particularly alarmed, and then they brought an application in the courts to stop Shell from undertaking those surveys. The primary consideration that these communities had was that they were not properly and adequately consulted in this process of granting that exploration right. So the procedure they used was they approached the South African High Court, and there's a procedure in terms of a statute called the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, where the court can review the decision of the decision maker, in which case was the Petroleum Agency. They can review that decision and look at how it made its decision. Now, there were two important aspects in how the court was going to review that decision. And the two aspects that I would like to look at is procedural unfairness and the other aspect is the failure to take into account relevant considerations. Now, this is the agency that is making the decision to grant the exploration right to conduct these seismic surveys. Now, on the first aspect, I'll speak about the procedural fairness, and then I'll speak about the aspect of relevant considerations. Essentially, in a nutshell, what Shell and its associated entities were arguing on the aspect of procedural fairness. They said, well, they looked at previous studies about who are the interested and affected parties, and then they consulted those interested and affected parties. Now, along the east coast of South Africa, amongst the indigenous communities, there were many communities that had monarchs or chiefs, and Shell argued that they consulted with these monarchs. Shell also said that they published advertisements calling for participation in local newspapers. However, an important point is that these newspapers were published in English and another South African language called Afrikaans. Now, Afrikaans is not a language that is widely spoken along this area where the seismic surveys were. It is in the Eastern Cape province, and the language predominantly spoken is Xhosa. So what we can see immediately is that this message was not necessarily reaching the communities that it was supposed to reach. They published these advertisements, they provided time for the communities to comment, they held public meetings. So Shell argued that they did what was required in terms of the law. However, the court said that simply one of the big issues was that these notices were published in languages that the communities did not have access to. They were published in newspapers that were not fully local newspapers. They were newspapers in large metropolitan areas. And a lot of people in these areas were illiterate and wouldn't have the ability to read the newspapers in the first place. So the court said, and this is a very important point and a very important takeaway, is that meaningful consultations consist not in just merely ticking off a checklist, but you have to engage in good faith, substantive, two-way processes aimed at achieving consensus. Public participation is not merely the ticking off of a checklist. It has to be more substantive. So the second part, so that first aspect related to procedural unfairness and where it was alleged that the Shell and the associated organizations did not engage in meaningful public participation. And the court found on that ground in favor of the coastal communities that there was insufficient public participation. Turning to the next consideration that the court looked at in reviewing the decision made by the decision maker was there were other aspects like the harm to biodiversity, climate change considerations, and the harm to the communities and their religious and ancestral beliefs. Now, the middle criteria, the harm to the communities and their ancestral beliefs, is what I want to focus on because this topic is looking particularly at social inclusion. This category in the middle is particularly important. The communities argued that their relationship with the ocean spanned generations, and they had a stewardship over the ocean, a sense of responsibility over the ocean. And in particular, the communities in this part of the world argued that the ocean space around the coastline was a sacred site where their ancestors resided. So the oceans itself, in this particular part of the world, in this particular region, the ocean was seen as a sacred site. In other parts, it's a place where there was a lot of fisheries that could take place for indigenous communities. But here, the ocean was seen as a site of a place, a holy site, a place where ancestors resided, the spirits of their ancestors. So what the communities argued further was that the top-down approach adopted by Shell and those associated entities was flawed because they consulted with monarchs representing indigenous communities. But the court said, and the communities argued, that in a constitutional democracy such as South Africa's, a community is separate from a chief, and monarchs do not necessarily speak entirely for their own subjects. Their own subjects have their own voice and their own rights. The communities also argued on 3 points, and I summarized it as being disturbed, disrespected, and disconnected. So they were arguing that the sounds that would come out from these seismic surveys that would be conducted to prospect for oil and gas along the coastline, it would disturb the spirits of their ancestors that lived within the ocean spaces. And as a consequence of that, their ancestors would be disrespected by the noise that is generated into the environment. That is notwithstanding all the other environmental concerns that are raised by introducing seismic surveys into an ocean space that impact whales and other marine life. Now, in disrespecting of the spirits of ancestors, they also argued that they would be disconnected from their ancestors. So the communities would be severed from the relationship they have with their ancestral spirits, and it deprives them of that fundamental meaning that arises from their shared practices, their identity, their dignity. And they needed to be consulted with. These communities needed extensive consultation as to what is going to be happening so that they could consult in their own way with their ancestral spirits to mitigate the adverse consequences of being disconnected from those ancestral spirits. Now, Shell, on the other hand, made several contentions. They said, well, we do not dispute that coastal communities have specific customary practices, they have specific rights, we acknowledge them, and we recognize them. However, they said that they complied with all the requirements in terms of the relevant statutes. So they said in terms of the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, the National Environmental Management Act, all the relevant legislation, they complied. They consulted in 2 languages. They said they used English and Afrikaans. Now, they said that the communities are saying that they have certain practices, they need to have certain procedures in place. So, for example, when I mentioned they needed to consult with their ancestors to mitigate the adverse consequences of being disconnected from those ancestral spirits, Shell and BB said, how can they be expected to follow a parallel customary law and procedure for each and every affected community along the coastline that might have different customary practices? In this instance, to these communities, the ocean space had a spiritual dimension. So further communities might have a more subsistence link to the ocean where they use it for fisheries. And so they also argued about causation. How can it be shown that the seismic surveys are going to cause the displeasure of ancestral spirits? They're saying, how can we objectively show that link? They also argued that these seismic surveys will take place far offshore, 20 to 80 kilometers off the coast. And so it wouldn't affect the coastal community's interaction with the immediate ocean space in front of them. They also argued that they conducted similar past surveys and there were no objections raised by coastal communities. And then they said the practices of the coastal communities were often esoteric, they are often hidden, they were often obscure customary rules and practices. How does a large conglomerate company intending on engaging in offshore mining, how do they know exactly what are the rules and procedures of small coastal communities? And when these larger companies would use the relevant statutes in play. So you see now you have these competing concerns about social inclusion, about the communities, and what kind of a role do they play in decisions that affect the ocean space around them. So it brings me more towards the close of this presentation, and I leave you with 3 points to consider. That the industry, these are large mining companies, energy companies, whether it's diamond mining, whether it's deep seabed mining, whether it's prospecting for oil and gas, these are important economic concerns for the coastal nation. There's definite interest in these going ahead from a policy perspective. How can they have clear indications of what they need to check off and tick off to ensure compliance, to ensure meaningful compliance? So which communities must be consulted? How must they be consulted? And then the communities now, the second aspect, coastal communities, to have social inclusion, they must have some assurance that their practices, their beliefs, their knowledge systems are recognized, and they must be protected as well. And lastly, in this trifecta of people that need to consider these factors are decision makers, that are governments. So in this instance, the South African government had to make, the relevant ministerial department had to make a decision on granting an exploration right, or later down the line, an exploitation right. And the decision maker must be satisfied that all of the relevant considerations, the in particular public participation, has taken place fully and meaningfully, and before they're able to make their decision. So that then is an interesting perspective from South Africa, the cases that have appeared before our courts that looked at this aspect of social inclusion and the challenges that arose. So I'll leave it at this point, and I want to thank you for listening to that presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, for giving us a concrete example of a tentative process, or maybe more of a check of the box process to include communities in interventions that would have a huge impact on their livelihoods. And how consultation process should be changed to actually be inclusive. And it was a very nice follow-up of the overview previously given by Yanga. So while we wait for questions from the audience, don't be shy. Please submit your questions. I will ask one question, same one to both speakers, to get the discussion going. And I would like to move closer to the community level and also looking at the younger generation. So how can you, Yanga, I'll start with you. How can youth and coastal communities be empowered to shape climate and energy solutions rather than simply being consulted? And for example, what actionable steps they can take or can institutions can take? What's your opinion?
Yeah, no. Firstly, I think the big part of it is recognizing and not seeing young people as homogenous. I think there's a tendency in policies in how they engage with young people, period, as seeing them as one particular kind of group. And a group that needs the same thing and always wants the same thing, and the policies are geared to it almost as if they all speak the same language in terms of their problem. I think in terms of coastal resilience in and of themselves, more often than not, the young people that are there are the ones that are inheriting the information from the older generation that's teaching them. lessons of how to take care of the ocean and how to be stewards of the ocean. And so there's a huge value that comes from them, and for them not to just be a tick in the box of, okay, we engaged with the young people and now we're moving forward, but also recognizing the fact that they are the mouthpieces and will be the future mouthpieces of how we understand Indigenous knowledge and how we engage with it. And then I think the most important thing when it comes to anything with young people is always remembering the fact that it's not enough to just have them in the room. It is very important to have their concerns be centered in the room in and of themselves and not just having them as an afterthought. I think it's important that we rethink how we understand youth engagement and how we understand the different ways that young people can express themselves. And it stretches itself into coastal communities as well and how they can move forward with that. And so I think from a policy perspective, at least, for policies to stop treating young people like they all have the same problems. It's all different. There's different kinds of experiences that they have, and it's very important to approach it in such a way. So that's my very short answer for it.
No, it's very insightful, and thank you, Yanga. And again, it's again telling us not to do the check the box
Mm.
process. Thank you. Vishal, could you give us your perspective?
So with youth, you would see that in South Africa as well, there's a lot of migration of youth from coastal communities, traditional communities, into large urban centers that entail a change of lifestyle living in urban areas and cities. And so sometimes that kind of traditional knowledge transfer can be lost in that particular process. And what I think is important, and coming from my legal background, what I'd like to share is that there are ways in which this indigenous knowledge can be preserved, and aspects through you have to, Indigenous Knowledge Systems Acts, where you have registers of indigenous knowledge, where even if it's not effectively passed down to a new generation, it is appropriately documented in a piece of legislation where there is a register of indigenous knowledge. Now, if there is such a register of indigenous knowledge, you can find that large companies that are coming in wanting to engage in mining activities along our coastline, they want to consult with communities. This is a source of something where they can find out what exactly, how they need to tailor their public participation process to ensure that it is a meaningful consultation. So yeah, that's my take on bringing in youth and also incorporating it with, relating it to heritage legislation. There's this concept called, when I mentioned in the presentation about how the oceans is seen as a place where ancestral spirits reside. Now that's seen as part of intangible cultural heritage, and there is a lot of heritage legislation which could incorporate these notions of intangible maritime cultural heritage in it. So when consultations processes take place, they look at those considerations. They look at indigenous knowledge systems, they look at intangible cultural heritage.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your perspective. So we have now one question from Natalia Espinalvarez, and she says the presentations were very interesting, offering a completely different perspective. And she's very curious to know how the process of creating awareness about social inclusion has been, and what you think is needed to move from recognition to active participation from the local communities. Um, who wants, Yanga, do you want to go first?
I actually think that one is targeted more for Vishal with the social inclusion aspect.
Sure.
Yep. Sorry, I just I forgot my last slide, and I think that I didn't share that, but I think it's important here. So, for example, you can see here where they're calling, these are advertisements, that are talking to people. Now, this is along the West Coast, and they're calling for a future free from destructive mining. So you're seeing here they're calling different kinds of communities like surfers, fishers, ocean lovers to come across along and engage in a kind of a resistance or protest to that. So this is where you're seeing a lot of activism that is being generated. And another interesting aspect in the court matters that I referred to, the case is titled Sustaining the Wild Coast. Now, in a court case, you often find the names of parties. So you find Shell versus the minister, etc. But here, one of the parties is Sustaining the Wild Coast. So that's a non-governmental body that has locus standing to bring an action before the courts. So you're seeing here, one of the useful things is that in South African law, you have a wide jurisdiction where community organizations can bring class-based actions against that. So you have empowerment. You're not finding one, impoverished community with one person standing alone against a massive multinational corporation. So you see here, you can have a real, almost, it's not a case of David and Goliath. You can find communities can gather together and bring in class actions. You can find environmental activists that join in the litigation. So that brings it into a different level where there can be a proper contention in court of the issues. Yeah.
Thank you. So it's very important to have activism as also ONGs working to give a voice to the communities. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different answer for that in terms of how it's affecting the mining industries here in South Africa. If you're looking at it from the energy perspective. So there's essentially two key problems that we are facing at the moment. And there was a study that was released by UN DCP where it was showing that 58% of the mining community here in South Africa feels quite excluded in any and all just transition decisions that are being made. And a feeling of just transition decisions are being made at a top level, but they don't trickle down very well into a localized community level. And rightly so, because a lot of communities in our mining towns have experienced historical patterns of exclusion, even though they're like the most affected by the transition if it were to happen, right? And then so some of the emerging solutions that are coming up is there's an increase of kind of community ownership models where there's a push for socially owned renewable energy projects where the communities own and benefit from solar mini farms and decentralized energy. And there's also kind of proposals from mining companies to finance those community-owned renewable projects that could supply power back to the mines. So those are just some of the like solutions that have been coming up with that, where you have a community-led version of social inclusion in the energy space. And also, of course, which is a tenet of just transition, is the desire and the need to have skills and economic diversification. So you have the transfer of that. And there's a really, really strong community interest in reskilling for agriculture and renewable energy, transport, etc., and tourism. And interestingly, especially in our province in Mpumalanga, and our province in Mpumalanga is the mining province, essentially, there's a huge prioritization of women participating in those projects. And part of why that was made possible, or at least us having this kind of community ownership models emerging now, is because a lot of policy red tape was removed, courtesy of the Climate Change Act of 2024, and also some decisions that were made by the president through the Presidential Climate Commission, where there was an encouragement of what we call IPPs, or independent power suppliers. And previously, there was a lot of red tape where it was just government that was going to overlook the whole process. And so those kind of solutions are coming up, but it's not without any problems. When you have a mining company that has got its own finances to be able to be completely off grid without consulting a community, that part of social inclusion kind of gets lost in translation. And then you end up having a community that resists moving towards the green future because they seeing it as an equivalent of their future being destroyed because you're interrupting their life, and then they advocate for coal to remain, but not because they don't understand the future of the environment or anything, but it's because you just had this person now that's implementing this green solution, but it's at the cost of my my living, my food, my stomach. And so, you know, there's that constant pushback and back and forth that's happening for us there in the industry. And it does come down to not consulting the community first and not having social inclusion at the center, and more often than not, just having economic gain being the first priority. So yeah, we're working on it, but we'll get there.
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. I hope, at least. Um, so, yep. So I have another question. Um, Now moving towards a more um, a global or regional cooperation, like focus on the Atlantic region. Looking across the basin, do you see, or where do you see most promising opportunities for collaboration to advance climate action, energy access, and social inclusion at the same time? Is there a mechanism or partnership that you would prioritize? Sorry for my voice. Um,
Okay, I
yeah.
can throw in a small comment. So in the you often you often would see small island developing nations, or they would rather be called large ocean states instead of small island developing nations. They're quite active in the Indian Ocean rim. You're finding Mauritius, Seychelles, and the Maldives are very active in communicating the negative effects of sea level rise and climate change. And then you're also finding Pacific Island nations, the Pacific Islands Forum as well, that they have been quite active. But an interesting way in which countries along the island nations in the Atlantic can also be a part of that is, as we've seen 2 years ago, a matter was brought by the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. And they asked that tribunal one of the questions are, what are the obligations of states in respect of climate change, and whether that can be extended into greenhouse gas emissions into the marine environment that ultimately affect greenhouse gas emissions totally, encourages climate global warming, and facilitates sea level rise. So you found that Atlantic island nations, Antigua, Barbuda, etc., they were part of this Commission of Small Island States. So that's a good exemplar of where there's been a form of cooperation into bringing about something where it's gone to an international tribunal that was influential. Now, the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea doesn't produce binding decisions, but it is very influential in how states consider their obligations. And it's an authoritative pronouncement. So that's a good example of that. But as I think also sometimes you'd find that sea level rise itself, one might think that the sea just rises all at the same time, but it doesn't actually. I mean, different regions of the world, they experience this in different ways. So you're finding it very pronounced in areas in the Pacific Islands, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, etc. They're feeling very pronounced sea level rises, but eventually this might reach crisis levels in island nations in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic, in different and it manifests in different ways. Might not necessarily be the extent of which sea levels rise, but cyclones and storms might be far more frequent, particularly affecting the resilience of coastal communities. So yeah, so they can take a lot of lessons from small island developing states and join in these cooperative organizations that can take actions forward.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we have our biggest benchmark case that we always reference as one of the most successful just transition cases, which was in Germany's Ruhr region, where they were able to close down a power plant in 2018, but transitioned over 600,000 coal workers into different sectors. in the country, whether it was through university education or they built what we call a knowledge-based economy through that transition with the reskilling that came from it. And essentially what had worked there was a combination really of three things, where you had union representatives and local politicians who worked together to compensate and kind of retrain coal workers with mines, launching different kind of campaigns that helped, one, for the understanding from the miners and the workers themselves that the transition was going to happen, but also that there was a way for them to be replaced into something else in the economy. And then also part of that process, which was something that was concerned about, was how could a regenerative economy come out of it for mine workers, for example, that just would not have the reskilling to go to a university if they were only technically trained, for example, just to mine. And they actually ended up having a cultural heritage site through UNESCO called the Zolveren Heritage Site, which has created tourism. So a different kind of economy kind of came out of that. And then, of course, then there was the International Building Exhibition, which in and of itself had created thousands of jobs and is still continuing with a job process today. And so that's kind of like the benchmark case study example that we always talk about like how does a just transition process actually work, where there is no one left behind and where everyone is included. Now, of course, terms and conditions applied with this particular thing because it took over 60 years to be able to do that transition and for it to work in the way that we wanted to. But I think the biggest thing that we learn from that, and we still are learning from it, is it's very important to have long-term strategic planning in how we engage with our stakeholders when it comes to this. And that part is also important. Stakeholder engagement is extremely crucial. The union representatives played a really, really big role in pushing through the policies that made it possible for that coal mine to be able to transition in of itself. But also the most important part for me is kind of recognizing that we have to start before jobs themselves are lost. Where sometimes there's a delay to the response where you just find yourself in the transition and then you start talking about the transition at that point. And that's very risky whenever that happens, because you're bound to have some sort of exclusion from it because you are reacting immediately. And that's where that long-term strategy becomes extremely important. And for us not to just use the idea of a just transition as just a word that we are throwing around. There has to be financial investments that are tangible and clear in how that transition is actually happening. How does it look like for the transition to happen in the maritime world? What does and how much money are we investing into making the maritime world green? What's our progress with green fuel in making our ships green? Like, what does that actually look like? What's the money outcome of that looking like? Instead of us just using it as a buzzword. So I think that's very, very important, but that's the main one I can think of at the moment. There are a couple of other examples as well in Scotland, really bad examples too during Margaret Thatcher's presidency, but we don't talk about that. But yeah, there's just some examples I can think of.
Thank you, Yanga. I mean, it's important. Yep, it's really encouraging, and I think it gives hope to people when we have these really nice examples. And even though, like you say, it took about 60 years to see, uh, but then it's really important to have a long-term planning because nothing happens within a day, right? And we have to have this vision. So thank you for both answers. It was really nice to from Vishal to see that there's different ways to have your voice heard. Even if you don't reach the policymakers, you can reach a group of people or a mechanism that have a big influence on decision making. And thank you, Yanga, to give this example that is really important to have, like repeating what I said, a long-term planning. There's bad examples, there's all good examples, and we need to look at those good examples and be able to adapt to our own realities and conditions and all that. So thank you very much. I don't see any questions. It seems that our audience is a little bit shy. But we are very close to the ending the session. And I invite the speakers, if you have something else to say, or yeah, just please feel free. I see that it's nice to see there's a connection being made during in the chat with you, Yanga, from Kotso Calvin. So it's already a very big win for the webinar. Yeah, so if you have more insights to share, please feel free, or we will close the session.
Just from my side, I just want to say, firstly, to the ocean community, sorry. Energy placed us here in the first place. I'm not ignorant to the fact that we are here because of, fossil fuel consequences. It's the biggest contribution to the climate challenges that we have today. And there are some of us on the ground fighting very, very hard to correct human mistakes. And we will do so. And I think there's a lot of potential in some of the ways that those mistakes can be corrected to come through from the ocean in and of itself. And I've been learning an incredible lot in the process too. I think it's very important from us in the energy sector to notice and to be aware of the fact that we need to clean up our house in order for the blue house to be cleaned up as well. And I think it's very important for us as well to also recognize that the idea of a green economy doesn't exist without a blue economy in and of itself. And so that progress is happening and the process for it is happening. And having platforms like this really does help in trying to see where the progress is. And I want to thank everyone who joined here today for being here and coming to listen to our thoughts. And I hope you can walk away with something as well. Thank you so much, Tanya, as well, for organizing. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Vishal, would you like to say something?
Yeah, just in terms of the parting remarks, the little story that I gave you with the cases, it seemed that there was a victory for the coastal communities in that they were not effectively consulted with. But in a sense, it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory in a sense that the big companies can go back and still do a tick box approach and says, okay, we've now consulted with the communities directly instead of the monarch, etc. But what's really not that clear is that we talk about social inclusion and by extension, public participation, but the extent of the public participation and to what extent is that participation sufficient or meaningful? That is something that still has to be determined. So a big company says, yes, we've now gone and consulted with this particular community. We've taken these steps. But it is not very clear, and that's something that is left to be determined. And when we look at broader O2 documents, it speaks of social inclusion. And the point that I want to make is that when we bring it at a micro level, what is the extent of that contribution, that participation, and that exclusion? When has it been met? So that's my parting shot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your participation. And I learned a lot. I come from a marine biology background, and so listening to you was really interesting and really inspiring. Yeah, so I want to thank also the audience, the people that participated. And just to let you know again, we have recorded this session and it will be available on the All Atlantic Alliance YouTube channel after the webinar. And yeah, please follow us for the next webinar sessions. Thank you. Bye bye.